Well, chronic wasting disease is a prion disease of members of the deer family. So prion diseases include a number of human diseases, most of which are relatively rare. The most common of which is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It would also include diseases like bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease. And there are some others out there. There's a camelid spongiform encephalopathy. There's one of mink, transmissible mink encephalopathy. There's one for felids. But chronic wasting disease is interesting because it's one of relatively few of the transmissible spongiform encephalopathy classified prion diseases that is transmissible efficiently from animal to animal in a horizontal sort of way. So and there are others that may be transmissible. So BSE or mad cow. Um, that there was a problem with that in Europe back in the 90s, and I'm old enough to remember that kind of where bone meal from infected cattle that they didn't necessarily know were infected was being fed as a like as a calcium supplement. This was primarily occurred in Europe to other cattle, and they were becoming infected, but cattle weren't transmitting that from animal to animal, so it was relatively easy to sort of get under control. Ditto with diseases like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That's not transmissible from person to person. Um, but in things like, there may be questions in things like blood transfusions about, have you ever been diagnosed with CJD? Years ago, I think there were a few cases of iatrogenic infection. So that would be, incidents that occurred during surgery. And that was years ago. And they of course, realized what the issue was in the intervening time. And that's no longer a big deal. But CWD is transmissible from animal to animal quite efficiently, which makes it difficult to control and makes it very concerning once it becomes established. And in CWD, as in essentially all other transmissible spongiform encephalopathy prion diseases, it's invariably fatal. So all infected individuals are going to die, as a result of the disease. There's no treatment, there's no cure at this point in time, and that applies to the human prion diseases as well. Our first identification of chronic wasting disease in West Virginia was back in 2005 in Hampshire County. So since then, we now have 6 counties that are known to be affected by CWD. Of course, the overwhelming bulk of our positive cases have been in Hampshire County, where we know disease has been now for about 20 years. And all of those counties are contiguous over in the eastern panhandle of the state. So we don't have any positive counties that are known in kind of your primary viewing area. In general, probably one of the biggest differences is there are some special regulations in place in what's known as the CWD containment area. So that includes counties that are known to harbor CWD positive animals and counties that are adjacent where a positive has been detected relatively close to that county line. So those regulations include things like restrictions on hunting with the use of bait and feeding deer at any time. So in the remainder of the state, that's generally lawful to do, although we in general recommend against it, just because there are some known potential health implications associated therewith. You may see things like increased parasitism. There may be some elevated risk for other disease transmission there. But it's lawful to do in the rest of the state. The other major thing is we have restrictions in the CWD positive counties on transporting certain carcass parts that we know from scientific research harbor burdens of infectious material. So if you say traveled from Braxton County and you hunted over here in one of the CWD containment area counties that was a positive county with carcass transport restrictions, essentially all you could take home with you are boned out quarters of meat or boned out meat. If you harvested a buck, you could only, you'd have to either cut the antlers off or remove the skull plate, clean it of brain tissue and any other tissue. And then things like, cleaned hides and finished taxidermy mounts are legal to take out. But the entire goal of that is and of the baiting and feeding restrictions are to reduce human facilitated movement of infectious material and or congregation of deer that may facilitate spread of Because of the nature of CWD, disease generally follows a fairly prolonged course. There's a very lengthy latent period where clinical signs of disease aren't going to be grossly apparent. So, from time of infection to time of death, you're usually thinking about maybe 18 to 24 months with chronic wasting disease in deer. So, at any given time, because of that lengthy latent period, the overwhelming bulk of animals that are on the landscape are going to appear to be outwardly healthy. It seems like probably within about a month or so of the terminal portion of disease, that's when animals would start to exhibit some of the clinical signs of it, and then would kind of rapidly go downhill in terms of their physical condition. But at any given time, most deer are going to appear to be healthy. So, the DNR, we're not a public health agency, but we generally, defer to public health agencies when it regards public health questions. So, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have stated that they would strongly encourage hunters to consider having their deer tested for CWD if they hunt in an area where CWD activity is known to exist. The DNR conducts statewide surveillance for chronic wasting disease. We use primarily roadkills, but we also, we'll sample deer that are considered to be targets. So that would be deer exhibiting clinical signs of disease that we receive reports about from members of the public. If a deer tests positive or appears to be sick, it's recommended that just out of an abundance of caution, that animal not be consumed and should be disposed of. We're kind of monitoring as time goes on. So initial cases of chronic wasting disease were identified in the American West, and indeed before about the year 2000, cases in wild deer were essentially limited to the states of Colorado and Wyoming, where the initial cases in captive research animals had been identified back in the 60s and 70s. So most of the knowledge about what to anticipate with regard to a population comes from those Western states where there's been more time to see what the long-term effects are. So because of sort of the creeping insidious nature of CWD, most epidemiologists have described it as a 30 to 50 year disease outbreak, where you may not see what the long-term consequences of disease are for decades after your initial detection, once prevalence becomes very high across a wide scale. So we do a number of things in Hampshire County. We do distance surveys for deer density every year here, and we do distance surveys across the rest of the state too on a rotational basis. We also have our Hampshire County deer study that's going on, which is part of the larger statewide deer study, where we captured and marked over 100 deer in Hampshire County with GPS collars. Those collars will stay on for about 3 years, and we've been determining cause-specific mortality of those deer. We basically, we collared those and captured them on private lands where the landowners hunted or allowed people to hunt. So we were doing our best to make sure we weren't putting these deer online in places that they were, to all intents and purposes, protected and weren't going to be vulnerable to hunter harvest. And our collared research animals are, of course, fair game for hunters. So, one interesting thing is, we certainly expected to lose some deer in Hampshire County as chronic wasting disease clinical cases. That is to say, exhibiting extensive evidence of muscle wasting and emaciation in the general absence of other obvious disease processes. I don't know that any of us anticipated that it was going to be our leading cause of death, but at present, we've lost more deer in Hampshire County as chronic wasting disease clinical cases than we have to hunter harvester to any other individual cause. And of course, in our other study area counties in Mason and Jackson County, Barber and Upshur County, hunter harvest has been our leader, essentially, as we would anticipate that it would be. Those counties are not known to be affected by chronic wasting disease. And, indeed, our surveillance efforts in those counties have not identified any positive animals. So the moral of the story is that it's kind of ongoing here to determine what is occurring with the deer population. I would anticipate that if when we see something happen, we'll likely see it in Hampshire County first because we've had CWD there the longest, prevalence there is the highest, but there is certainly evidence from the American West, from studies in both mule deer and white-tailed deer of population declines in the long term, which seems to be driven primarily by decreased survival, not through any decrease in fecundity, which, fawn production. So that decreased survival period. And, you may, as you have deer having shorter life expectancies, with positive animals, of course, exhibiting much higher annual risk of mortality than deer that are not infected. The lifetime reproductive potential of those animals may also decrease, but it seems like survival is the big driver in that case. As usual, if people see sick wildlife, we encourage people to make reports to the DNR because we are a small but mighty force, so we rely on members of the public. If they see something strange going on with wildlife, if they're seeing sick animals, to let us know about it so we can investigate and see if we can determine what's going on there. So the clinical signs of chronic wasting disease, when they're present, emaciation, muscle wasting are going to be very apparent ones. Things like excessive salivation, excessive thirst, excessive urination may be observed. General neurological signs, so things like loss of fear, ataxia, so inability to stand, sometimes tremors, involuntary muscle twitching. Then you have things like head droop, ear droop. In general, the animals will appear to be very unthrifty, and those, like I said, they're clinical signs of disease. But of course, the difficult thing about CWD is there are other things that could cause an animal to look like that. So things like a chronic infection that's been sort of slowly dragging the animal downhill over time. So the only way to know for sure is to do necropsy examination and conduct postmortem testing for CWD. But if people see a deer that matches those signs, that's something that we would definitely like to know about, and something that they should report to their DNR district office that serves their area, so we can investigate. Because the earlier we make a detection on CWD, the earlier we can try to get some intervention measures in place to attempt to keep it from spreading outward elsewhere, through human facilitated or human abetted means. CWD, as I mentioned earlier, it's at this point in time it's only known to affect and be transmissible among members of the deer family. So in West Virginia, that's essentially limited in a wild setting to white-tailed deer, although we do have some elk. They're down in the southern part of the state, but we've had no CWD that was found anywhere close to them, which is good. But it's also one of the reasons we continue to conduct statewide surveillance. We want to know where it is so we can identify what risks may be there. Elsewhere in the United States, moose are susceptible, elk are susceptible, mule deer are susceptible. We know from the Scandinavian countries that caribou are susceptible, but CWD has not been found in caribou in the United States, which we have very few caribou left in the U.S. But in Canada, there are still quite a few. But yeah, it's generally not considered to be a health risk to other non-cervid animals, and is not considered to be a human disease at this point in time. But of course, research is still ongoing. There are still some unknowns about how that prion may behave over time. So, out of an abundance of caution, I know public health officials recommend against consuming any known positive animal, or indeed any animal that appears to be sick or otherwise unfit for consumption.